We began to talk a little bit more about the pathology of ignorance and the lack of knowledge. And we touched very briefly a little bit on the pathology of desire and pleasure. But this last presentation, we'll go into that a bit more deeply. The faculty of man's nature, which we would call desire, has been given to us by God in order that we might yearn for Him, and through that yearning, be raised up and united to Him. So, how important is that? So, if that's the faculty that accomplishes that, pretty important. So, by the way, we could add like 15 more sessions, and we could go through the pathologies of all kinds of things. And we could get into every single sinful passion, for example, whether it's anger. I wanted to try and get into the incisive aspect of the soul. That's that aggressive anger part, along with this desire. We just didn't have time to fit it in. So, but maybe we'll find, if people are interested, find some other opportunity. But that one will be important, because I think the two most important are desire and anger. So appetites and incisive aspect of the soul. But maybe we'll look for an opportunity to add that in. But this one at least is at the very core. Quote 21, St. Nicholas Cavasilis. The eye was created for light, the ear for sounds, everything for its end, and the soul's desire so as to soar up towards Christ. And St. Simeon again, Christ our God is the goal of all desire. Very interesting, because in both groups I sat in on, this became kind of part of the conversation. I don't know about the other two groups. And making our desire for Christ. All desire of every sort, all desire, there's two desires. Remember, everything, it's binary. We're presenting a binary option here. It's either this or it's that. We're going to make that clear in a moment. That's what Christ teaches. All desire is linked to pleasure. Desire, according to nature, results in intense spiritual delights. If you've never experienced intense spiritual delights, then it may be difficult to imagine what that could be like. But once you tasted them, unless you lose your mind, which we do sometimes, we can taste that the Lord is good and sort of forget about God. That does happen. But once you taste of intense spiritual delights, you long for it like nothing else. St. Maximus says, in ordering human nature, God endowed its mind with a power of pleasure that enabled it ineffably to delight in Him. This divine, this blessed delight for us is our highest joy. It's why we exist. And we draw out from our participation in the life of God this infinite pleasure. That's what Christ calls for us, perfect joy. That's why He made us for this joy. St. Maximus says, there is only one happiness. We're back to that singularity. There is only one happiness, the common life of the soul with the Word. The soul pleasure is access to divine things. Man in his natural state before the fall found God as his sole source of pleasure. Now, I'm going to say some things that you're going to maybe you're going to kind of have a little resistance to at first, but stick with me. Stick with me, because what I'm going to tell you is true. 100% true. So, but you're going to go, oh, well, you're not going to like it at first. He found his delights only in the one Lord, says St. Gregory of Nyssa. And he adds that Adam did not delight in mixed goods in paradise. St. Maximus says the same. He says, quote, God, the Word who created the nature of men, did not establish sensual pleasure along with it. The devil, through envy, by the way, that was the sin of the devil, he was envious, persuaded man, says St. Maximus, by a deception to let his soul's desire pass from what was permitted to what was forbidden, and to turn away by transgression from the divine command. Athanasius teaches us that man was tempted by the serpent to delight in other pleasures, still unknown but more immediately and easily accessible. It's a very interesting observation. Than the spiritual delights for which his nature made him yearn, but which he still only attained partially, the perfect possession of which could not be obtained until the fullness of his spiritual growth should be reached. Did y'all follow that? So basically the devil tempted Adam to take the short path to pleasure, the quick and easy route, quick pleasure, quick fix, which was a pale imitation of the real thing. That's essentially what Athanasius is saying. Boy, how often do we do that? Daily, hourly. So Adam was destined, now this is important, Adam was destined to delight in sensible realities. He was destined to have pleasure from creation in sensible realities, but to delight spiritually in them, in God by means of their spiritual reasons, their logo, the divine energies. So Maximus teaches that man stands in the center of creation as a laboratory in which everything is consecrated, comes together in this unified whole. And he's that medial location for all parts of creation. Maximus says everything that's far, everything that's near, everything that's great, everything that's least. And he unifies the sensible creation to the intelligible aspects of creation through the contemplation of creatures logoi, and then he offers in thanksgiving to God. Of course, Adam turned away from this task and everything formed like a mirror, shattering into a living Jesus. St. Maximus says, he moved contrary to his nature, madly and of his own initiative, making a bad use of the natural faculty which had been entrusted to him in his constitution, with an eye to the unification of what was separated, so as rather to work at separating things united. And Adam desires creatures in an end in themselves, and he wants to take pleasure in them egotistically, or self-centered reasons. Quote number 22. Adam wanted to lay hold of the things of God without God and before God and not according to God. Just chatting with someone out there about eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam believed the devil that if he did this, he would be independent of God as the source of what is good and evil, that he would be the arbiter of what is ontologically true and real and good. So he sought pleasure contrary to nature, a pleasure, as St. Gregory of Nyssa says, a pleasure introduced by deception was the beginning of decline. A pleasure introduced by deception was the beginning of decline. So the devil played on Adam's desire and his expectation of pleasure. But he showed him an easier path to pleasure. St. Cyril of Scythopolis said Adam preferred what had seemed delectable to his carnal eyes over intelligible beauty. I mean, because you can, it's quick, it's easy. It's immediate, instead of having to do the hard work of chasing after God. So, but in this movement, in this turning away from, going after God, using his faculty of desire in its natural sense to go after God, shifting it towards what's immediate and close to him, sensible things. They're close. You can see them. You touch them. We're flesh. Again, it's all tied to our fleshliness. So, he takes the fruit. It's there. It's sweet. It's good to the eyes. It's immediate to us. It's sensual. It's sensible. Instead of what is invisible, what is spiritual, what is more difficult to see and understand. Something that you have to trust God. The Lord, we have to trust God. We can't see. And he says, come this way. Yes, but Lord, I can't. Come this way. Trust me. But we can see this. We know the cupcake is going to be delicious. It's right there. It's only 62 cents away. But I got to go to church, for 4 hours, and I can't eat before, and this different kind of life. St. Athanasius says, neglecting the higher realities and slow to grasp them, men sought rather those which were closer to them. Now that which is closer is the body and the senses. Likewise, they turned their mind away from intelligible things and began to consider themselves. So it just goes from the Twinkie right back to yourself. It really becomes egotistical. And considering themselves, becoming attached to their body and other sensible things, and erring, so to speak, in their own reason, they came to desire themselves, preferring their own possession to the contemplation of divine realities. So when man turns his desirative power away from God and the divine energies of God within creation, which was his natural orientation, then that desirative power becomes unnatural and goes against reason. It's perverted, it's distorted, and it becomes ill. It becomes sick. It's toxic, and it spreads throughout our whole nature. Quote 23, St. Maximus. Evil is the mismanagement of the innate faculties' action towards their end, and absolutely nothing else. So simple. Somebody just said the thing. It's so simple. Sometimes, the truth just cuts straight through. That's the essence of evil. Additionally, evil is the irrational movement of the natural faculties towards something other than the end, according to an erroneous judgment. I call end the cause of beings, towards which all things gravitate by natural desire. He's calling God end. St. Maximus goes on to say that sensual pleasure is the soul's energy against nature. Sensual pleasure is the soul's energy against nature. He says, quote, and cannot have any other origin for forming itself than the soul's resignation when it shrugs off things according to nature. Remember when we earlier said the 3 great ploys of the devil? Ignorance, forgetfulness, and disregard. That's what he's saying here, disregard. And cannot have any other origin for forming itself than the soul's resignation when it shrugs off things according to nature. Okay, so this is not like some, you're out murdering cats or, I don't know, dropping bombs on the city. It's not that insidious. You are shrugging off God. Disregard. Just a simple disregard. Forgetting God, disregard. How many of us? We go through our day, the Holy Spirit's whispering to us about what, your life is over here. Your joy is over here. And we just, you're going to do this. Now, this is an interesting question. When we think about the fall, we might ask this question, what came first? Ignorance of God or the lure did sensual pleasure cause his ignorance of God, or did his disregard for God cause him to look elsewhere for pleasure? And this question is posed by a bunch of the fathers, but you kind of get different positions. And by the way, in some of these things that we're talking about, there's not just one right answer. There are often many right answers that don't conflict with one another. In this case, I think it's a chicken and egg question in some sense. But maybe we could say that the lure of the sensible, he saw that it was good for the eyes, that the devil deceived him, the devil drew him towards that sensible thing that was so easy and accessible to him. And he drew him out, and through the deception of the devil and the sensory pull, Adam was pulled away from God, and it resulted in Adam forgetting about God, disregarding God, and entering into a state of ignorance. For you and I, we're born in a state of fallenness and the stain of sin, and we're sort of born enslaved to this carnality and sensuality, and the lust of the flesh is already at work in us from our very beginning in our fallen nature to keep us in ignorance. And this just perpetuates our disregard for God. But at any rate, whichever comes first, these two things play off of one another reciprocally. They're mutually reinforced. Sensual pleasure perpetuates our ignorance. Ignorance perpetuates our lust for sensual pleasure. So they're working off of each other. Quote 24, St. Maximus. The more that man went after sensible things through his senses alone, the more ignorance of God that overcame him. The more he was enslaved by the ignorance of God, the more he gave himself over to the delight in material things known empirically. The more he was imbued with this pleasure, the more he aroused the self-love, which was the consequence of it. The more he cultivated self-love, the more he invented various means for obtaining pleasure, the fruit and goal of love of self. It just becomes this cyclical thing that we go down that path. The pursuit of sensual pleasure instead of spiritual pleasure gives birth to the sinful passions. And as we develop habits, we become enslaved to the passions. But what we're trying to do in the passions is we're trying to satisfy our desire. That's what we're doing. Except it's a perverse desire. It's a desire for the wrong thing. It's been perverted. And it is directly tied to sensuality. Meaning it's directly tied to the created, fleshly, created, carnal aspect devoid of spiritual realities. That's the nature. And so this has a lot to do with our spiritual exercises and asceticism. That's why we fast. Fasting is very much tied to the gateway to all of the other sinful passions. Nothing gets more bodily than, needing to eat to live. And this is not just some abstraction. This is actually like real, concrete, real. This is existentially a reality. We eat. And gluttony is tied very much to lust, too, by the way. So all these things, and the fathers, they studied all these things. God told Adam not to eat. He gave him the fast. Adam broke the fast. That's his first sin. So, like I said, pleasure of some sort always is tied to desire. Desire for God results in intense spiritual delights. But desire in a carnal, sensible thing, devoid of that, always results in pleasure, but pain. That pleasure is always pain. Always turns to pain. Always. Pain always follows sensual pleasure. And so man gets caught in the loop. He's seeking more pleasure to alleviate the pain caused by the pleasure. And that's what we do. And that's the definition of stupidity. Nothing basic. But we do it, right? We just keep doing it. Quote 25, St. Maximus again. Seeking to obtain pleasure and to avoid suffering, incited by self-love, man invents multifarious and innumerable forms of corrupting passions. He goes on. The vices present themselves in multiplied and various forms, according to the connection each has with human nature. They compel man, subject to the desire for pleasure and the fear of suffering, to serve them and to invent numerous forms of passions depending on the possibilities offered by the circumstances and means. So man has only one desirative faculty. We talk about this faculty of desire in man. You can either have desire for God, desire for sensible things. You don't have two desirative faculties. There's only one desirative faculty. Okay? So there's no two power sources in the human soul. Normal man uses it to propel him to God as his sole object of desire. And the sensual desires that we have in fallen man, they are the same desirative faculty, but perverted and turned away from its real goal, its normal goal. And they're turned against our own nature and towards sensible reality. All of that, really though, is a desire for God. So when you're desiring sensible things or carnal things, you're still desiring God. But you're ignorant of that. And you're searching for God in the wrong place. And that singular desire, in this direction, there's just one. It's very clear. Everything's one. In this direction, it's just multitudinous. There's so many things vying for our heart. We're going to try this, and we're going to try that, we're going to try all of these things, trying to reach that point of pleasure that we see. If you're dehydrated and your body's craving water, you might reach for a beer to quench your thirst. Right? But the beer is not going to give you what you desire. Your body is craving, desiring something. You reach for the beer, thinking that you're going to satisfy the desire, and it just dehydrates you further. But the desire is one. The desire is what it is. Okay? The desire is to get hydrated. And your action is just counterproductive. It just perpetuates the problem. And it's in a similar way, our desire for sensual things, for carnal things, is a perversion. And we do get some pleasure from them. But it's a counterfeit pleasure of the true good. And it always ends in pain. Always ends in pain. And this is not just, we're talking about desire. We're not just talking about gluttony or drink or sex or vainglory or pride. We even get some sick satisfaction out of our anger. We get angry at people. We like to play with telling this and we get some kind of satisfaction, pleasure out of that. So it's across the board. Quote 26, St. Gregory from Nyssa. Those who, having upturned all their power of desire and diverted the impulse of their thought on divine realities towards base and material objects, opened wide the field of inner being to the passions, to the point of ceasing all movement towards realities on high, and of beholding completely dried up the desire for God and spiritual realities, the inverted course of which has rushed towards the passions. Again, passing by as base and ephemeral as the objects that attract men's desires, which are held to be beautiful and are thus deemed worthy of zeal and favor, we must not squander among any of them our power of desire. It's an interesting lead to think about. we've got this power like in us, this faculty, this powerful thing. I mean, it's at the very core of what we are as a human being, this power of desire. And within this power of desire, depending on how we use it, we're either going to live or we're going to die. We're either going to experience intense spiritual delights and the joy for which God has made us by making Christ the sole object of our desire, or we are going to be broken into a million pieces and chasing after the wind and just in a cycle of fake pleasure followed by pain and emptiness. And it's right there for us to decide what we're going to do. St. Gregory says, don't squander it. Set your desire solely on Christ. That singularity of this desire, the faculty, is very important and a characteristic to focus on that the Fathers emphasize a lot. Quote 27, St. John Chrysostom, the same heart cannot suffice for several passions. One passion drives another away, and being shared it becomes weaker, the dominating passion drawing everything to itself. St. Isaac the Syrian, no one can possess at once the love of God and the love of this world. St. Gregory of Nyssa, our power of desire is not of such nature that it can simultaneously attend upon the sensual delights of the body and the spiritual marriage. St. Paul, for the desires of the flesh are against the spirit, the desires of the spirit are against the flesh, for these are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you would. Oh, and Jesus has something to say. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. This is how the mechanics, okay, this is a faculty, so there are mechanics to this faculty. There's ways in which it works according to the nature that God has created. And this is how it works, clearly. Right? Can we all agree? Like, nobody here is smarter than St. Gregory of Nyssa, and especially not Jesus. So, or St. Paul. This is how the mechanics of the desire faculty works in man. If it is directed in one direction, then it is not directed in the other direction. It's that simple. You can't get sweet water and bitter water from the same spring. It's going to be sweet or bitter. St. Gregory of Nyssa again, 28. The care for one necessarily leads to the separation from the other. So the more you desire sensible things, the less you're going to desire God. St. John Chrysostom. How is it that our love for Jesus Christ is so weak, except that we exhaust all the might of our soul in vain passions? So this is simple. I got people come to me all the time. Me too. Oh, my love has grown cold. Like, I don't know how to get it back. Well, stop chasing after all this worthless stuff. It's not complicated. You can't have a rich marriage with Christ and have a bunch of, lovers on the side. It doesn't work. It's him or them. Well, if you have them, it's them. That's what it is. You are going to desire something. That is in your nature to do so. St. Maximus says, he who does not know how to tread the spiritual path focuses all his efforts on the flesh. St. Gregory Palamas, if we do not love God with all our soul and heart, we will, according to St. Gregory Palamas, flutter about throughout this world and in its favor exhaust all or almost all the love of which our soul is capable. Now, that's on the negative side. There's a positive side to this, right? We can just flip it. So let's flip it and we'll focus on the positive side. The good news is that if we invest all of the desire into God, we will not be enslaved to the sinful passions and desires. St. Paul, number 29. walk by the Spirit, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. Saint Photiki, what desire for the goods of this world shall remain in him who is nourished by divine love? Saint Gregory Palamas, with those who have lifted their mind to God and exalted their soul by the passion for God, the flesh no longer possesses desires contrary to the Spirit. But we're afraid. We're afraid to give ourselves to God. We're afraid that we're going to disappear. We're going to lose ourselves. St. Simeon, the new theologian, the soul united to God by love cannot be drawn away by the body's pleasures and appetites, or even towards any other desire for any visible or invisible, be it an object of a passion, for the sweet love of God unites the impulses of his heart, or better said, all the inclination of his will. And once this, the will is bound to its own creator. How then can it burn with fever because of the body, or in the smallest way carry out its own desires? In no wise. I mean, this works out in a really practical way. The more you come to church, the more you want to come to church. The people that come real regularly can come with him then. And then something happens. You get sick, right? You get sick, and so it kind of breaks your routine. Or, whatever happens. You go on vacation. Or you get anxious, or you're having some stress at work, and instead of deciding to take this to God in prayer and trust him, you decide to just kind of like soak in your anxiety because you're having financial problems. And then sort of your routine, it gets broken, and you find yourself, and you sort of drift off. And then your heart kind of grows cold. And then you feel this separation. Can anybody attest to this? But when you're like getting yourself prepared, like when you're really making Christ the object of your desire, what ends up happening? Do you want him less? No, you want him more. You want him more and more and more. It engenders it. And wherever your treasure is, there will be your heart also. So man, we are in constant flux. We're always moving towards something, desiring something. And if we withdraw our desire from one thing and turn it towards something else, Saint Nikitas, number 30. As the soul is by nature mobile, it is subject to change. If she neglects attentiveness to divine things, she thus falls into mundane concerns. St. Athanasius. The soul is mobile by nature, and even if it is diverted from the good, it does not cease being in movement. Thus it moves, but this is no longer towards virtue, or so as to behold God. Giving its thought to what which is not, the soul transforms the power within it and makes use of it in order to turn to the desires it has imagined, since it has been created independent. The soul can incline towards good, but also turn away from good. And in turning away from good, it ponders utterly contrary things. For the soul cannot absolutely cease from being in movement, being by nature, as I have just said, very mobile. So, how fundamental is the problem of the pathology of desire in fallen man? I mean, it's a root, it's fundamental. Like if we could focus on that, if we could learn about the therapy to deal with our misguided desires, which is not that difficult, quite frankly, that the medicine is not complicated. It's not complicated, but it does require a person to, walk it out. You have to actually do something. St. Basil the Great said, desire is the illness of the soul. Desire is the illness of the soul. If we could get ourselves to simply shift that faculty of desire and orient it in the right direction. That's why I decided to stop with this and not squeeze in the aggression one, because really, this is the pillar of it all. You can do this, the other stuff will kind of start falling into place. Like if you can set your heart on Christ as your sole object, as the sole object of your desire, things are gonna work out just fine. That's what you have to concentrate on. I think I put a few more things in here about being stupid. The Father talked about this a lot. It's very helpful. I think somebody in the first group, it was revelatory to them to be thinking about what acting against our nature means. And it's insanity, the Fathers say again and again. To act against reason, which is to act against the Logos, which is anti-Christ. It's insanity. It's madness for a thing to act against its nature. Perfection and beauty, with the transcendentals, when we talk about beauty, something is beautiful. By the way, this is just an aesthetic kind of aside. Something is beautiful, metaphysically, when it is acting perfectly in accord with its nature. That's what makes a thing beautiful. But things are disordered and perverted. Everything's turned upside down. The values are reversed. And so there's no authenticity when we desire things that cause pain instead of pleasure, things that dissipate instead of last. When we throw all of our energy towards that which is undesirable by definition. We throw all of our desire-driven energy towards that which is undesirable. And then we show complete disregard for that which is truly desirable. And that's what we do. That's delusion. That's insanity. And that's man acting like an animal. Verse number 31, St. Maximus. Given over to the emotions of the senses alone, just like brute animals, the man, far away from divine and spiritual beauty, finds through the experience of the exterior incorporeal part of his nature a creation that he raises to the place of God, because this responds better to the needs of his body. So man fashions a multitude of false gods, idols, and he makes these according to the nature of perverted desire. In all of this, man has forgotten about God. It's like, this is his new world. He's forgotten about God. And he begins to measure the value of these things, all these various things, based on the intensity of pleasure that he gets from them. So we're seeking pleasure, and then we value this versus that, depending on what's going to give us the most pleasure. So we began to treat these things which were made, and which we should be giving thanks to God for, as objects. And the world becomes a projection of man's desires, and creatures become a means to satisfy his passions, instruments of pleasure. Man's relationship to creation is all perverted. Creation's lost its spiritual value, and then reduced to objects of pleasure. So the Father calls it fodder for the passions. And as man's moving towards this perversion, he can't discern the true good, even though that's what he really wants. And he's all confused. Having tasted the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he's in this mode of existence where good and evil are confused for him. He can't see clearly. He's lost the knowledge of what is true. St. Maximus says, man accumulates in himself a disordered knowledge of good and evil, affected by his experience of the senses alone. So our conscience, the Bible says, is seared. Our conscience is seared, like we have no discernment, no judgment about the truth of things. What's really true. Everything's distorted. And pleasure becomes the criterion for what is good. Pleasure becomes the criterion for what is good. Well, I like this worship style. I don't like that worship style. I think it's that silly. As Orthodox Christians, we inflict suffering on ourselves. So we certainly don't believe that pleasure is the criterion for what is good. We recognize the need to cause suffering in our life through fasting, standing on concrete for long hours, many hours at a time. So man's in a state of madness here, and he's just trying to find what pleases him, even though it's objectively harmful to him. And he runs away from what's good for him, like he's running away from something evil. Why? Why do we run away from God? Somebody was telling me, I don't know, a couple days ago, they were like clinging to something that was causing them pain, and they just didn't want to have anything to do with the very thing they knew that would bring them a sense of peace. Why? Because it annoys us on a sensual level. We're just annoyed by it on the most basic sensual level. That's why, by the way, let's throw this in. These presentations are way up here. We don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty, but that's why little things like learning how to sort of press through prayer when you're tired and your legs hurt. These small little things. So you learn to press through, ignore that your legs are hurting, and you are going to instead concentrate on your prayer and making that connection with God. What you're doing in this very small little embrace of some suffering is you are reordering reality for yourself. It's not just about your physical bodily comfort. It's about you laying hold of the true object of your affections, which is Christ, which you have to do. You have to go through that, especially in this fallen, corrupt world. We have to do that. We have to buffet the body. We have to deny ourselves. We have to take up our cross. We have to suffer. We have to, in these little ways, some people in great ways. For us, it's mostly little. Some of us, it's more than others, but it's pressing through all of these things to get to what our real goal is. And they can become barriers to us, distractions. So, verse number 32. Let's see, I'm almost. Are you all, can you just stay awake for a few minutes? St. Gregory comments, man seized and driven by wicked desires strives towards what seems beautiful to him, and man possessed by an ill-placed wrath fights for what seems to him to be the good. Every man without exception, if he is bound to a bad life, dedicates himself to what appears to him to be the best, and not to what really is. St. Gregory of Nyssa 33. Since then the majority take as good that which charms the senses, and since one word means both the real and the apparent good, the desire that hastens towards evil, as if this were good, is called by Scripture the knowledge of good and evil. This word knowledge signifying this interior disposition and mixing. St. Athanasius says, seeing that pleasure was for it a good, the soul exploited the name of good in its error, thinking that pleasure was the true and absolute good. Just like a man who seized by dementia might ask for a sword to strike those whom he meets and would believe wisdom to lie in that. What he's saying here is, we desire God, which gives us pleasure. God is the good, not the pleasure. The pleasure is a residual thing. Then man started seeking pleasure. Pleasure is had when God is sought, but pleasure is sought when evil is had. St. Gregory of Nyssa says, evil in its depths holds death like a hidden snare, but by a deceptive appearance shows forth an image of good. Gregory goes on. It happened that the intellect, led astray in its desire for what is true good, was diverted towards that which is not. Deceived by the instigator and counselor of vice, the intellect allowed itself to be persuaded that the good was the complete opposite of the good. So this is all this mixture, this misunderstanding about what is truly good. And we've been enchanted by the angel of light. I mean, he's a deceiver. That's what he's done. He's deceived us. The devil has deceived us. Man has been deceived. He lacks knowledge. And he's deceived. Now we're trapped in our deception by pleasure. Pleasure of the senses. I know it sounds awfully old-fashioned, what we're saying here. Very old-fashioned. 34, Athanasius. The soul took delight in the passions of the body and the only goods present. Beholding their semblances, the soul believed that only what was visible existed, and that only transitory and corporeal things were good. So, man has used his desire power on this perversion of reality, ends up in a delirious state where this faculty of desire goes into decline, atrophy sets in, because, the faculty of desire is bolstered, fed, it is encouraged, it is, strengthened. That power of desire is strengthened by God. When we're desiring things that are causing pain, it's continuing to break and weaken and lose its oomph. What would that be? Depression and despair. When he tried things, nothing's worth. It gives you pleasure and then pain, and pleasure and pain, and pleasure and pain, and just pain. After a while, the desired faculty starts to break down altogether, and a person just loses all momentum to do anything, to look for anything, to go anywhere. It's just lost. I mean, it effectually leads to suicide of the person, but it leads to utter despair and depression. I mean, the desire to faculty in man is a beautiful thing. It's the thing that propels you. It's the thing that makes you go. It's the gas in the Ferrari. It's the thing that makes life beautiful, fly. It's the thing that makes you soar. Well, when you're spending it on things that are just resulting in death and pain, it just gets mangled and mangled and mangled, and you just end up washing out instead of soaring. 35. Their life becomes deplorable. Speaking of these people. Their life becomes deplorable, says St. Maximus. They thus honor the very cause of the annihilation of their existence and themselves pursue without knowing it the cause of their corruption. St. Mark the Ascetic says the soul's throat is slit by the fire of bodily passions. So all of this to say our inclination towards evil is a sickness of nature, and it really is an illness of the desired faculty of man. And this illness of the desired faculty, the fact that it's been shifted in the wrong direction, spreads an illness throughout our whole bodies, our whole soul. And it alters, St. Maximus says, the faculties of the soul. So we don't function the way we ought. This is the pathology. This is where the illness lies. And the first effect of this inversion of desire is felt in our intellect, which we've talked about earlier, that pathology of ignorance and knowledge. And so, blinded by pleasure, we lost the knowledge of divine things, and we can't contemplate God. When you can't contemplate God, which is what we're made for, we end up disordered, fractured, no sense of peace, and, like stupid beasts. Another pathological effect of the perversion of the desire of power is this division of our faculties. We've talked about that. Instead of a singularity of purpose and focus of our desire, a unified heart and mind functioning within creation as a unifying force, which is what we should be doing to fulfill, to be who we are. Now we're divided, we're fractured, we're scattered, and there's all these things vying for our attention. And we can't even, it shows up in our prayer. We can't even pray. We can't pray. I mean, who can pray? We're lucky if we make it for 25 seconds. Our minds are wandering. And sometimes it's like excruciating to try and pray. St. Athanasius, verse number 36. Drifting away from the consideration of the desire for the one and being, I mean God, men entered into the diversity and multiplicity of bodily desires. St. Athanasius. Enamored by pleasure, the soul sets about procuring itself in very many ways. Evagries. The intellect roams with impassioned and is uncontrollable when it achieves the constitutive materials of its desires. So in this condition, we have no peace, no stability, and there's a restlessness. Theodotus of Philippi. As a man hastens to think of good, he immediately remembers evil. That's what I'm saying about our prayer. For as a result of Adam's disobedience, his memory finds itself sundered as in a duplex of thought. The St. Gregory of Palamas, number 37, says, those who commit themselves to corruptible and sensual pleasure exhaust all the desire of their soul in the flesh and thus become holy flesh. Gollum. Yeah, Gollum, right? He starts and it gets worse and worse and worse. His whole trajectory of his life. Okay? Pleasure. Well, I know this is so old-fashioned. Oh, this is just terrible. I'm so sorry. St. Maximus says, pleasure is the mother of death. I am a very sensual person. I like good food, good drink, beautiful things. So stick with me. This is, God made the creation for us to enjoy. So we can go so far down this path that we, as the fathers say, we lose the defining mark of our essential nature and become like unto the animals. Quote, brute and irrational, indistinct by driving them to impurity, renders them oblivious to human nature. The soul hunkers over bodily pleasures like beasts over their fodder. But as soon as those experiences of sensual pleasure come along, pain comes along right behind them. St. Maximus says, man learned by experience that every pleasure of a surety has pain as its successor. And not just physical pain, but psychological pain, psychological suffering. Because our intellect is not functioning, it's not focused on what it was made to focus on, which was God. Number 38. I'm almost done. St. Maximus, stick with me. I'd probably save the best for last, which is really bad. St. Maximus, number 38. The intellect acts contrary to nature when it attaches itself to the superficial, what is sensible and bodily, and from that moment it generates sorrow in the soul, being thrashed without respite by the wit of the conscience. St. Nicholas Codicillus. Did I include that in your opinion?
Yes.
Okay. Our capacity for desire has been adapted and proportioned. Oh, this is great. In mine, I highlighted it. Our capacity for desire has been adapted and proportioned to the immensity of this object of our desires. Nicholas says that God has matched our soul, our desire with power, and our whole being with himself. The human soul was created in function of Christ as a large box, vast enough to contain God himself. Now that is, go home and think about that. This goes back to the first presentation, that for us, that for us to be human means for us to be man-God. Like we are just finite, contingent creatures. If God removed his breath from us, we would cease to exist. And yet, as small and as little and as worthless apart from God as we are, we have been made large enough to contain the uncontainable God. And that's what St. Nicholas is saying. And that desire of capacity in you, that's where it all lies. That capacity to desire God is so powerful, so strong. It is godlike. Ye are gods, Christ said. so powerful that it can actually lay hold of the infinite God. That's back to St. Gregory. Don't squander it. Don't use it for Twinkies. You know? Use it for God. Because you can't go after both at the same time. This or that. Don't squander it. The capacity of man's delight, if the capacity of our desire could lay hold of the infinite God, the capacity of our delight is commensurate. He says, with the goods promised to us, meaning God himself, like the delight that God has intended from us in knowing him, the intensity of spiritual delight, we can't even begin to imagine what it is. And we can taste some of it here, now, in this life. The saints do. Sometimes we get a little glimpse. And yet we trade this ecstasy for other kinds of temporary pleasures that end in pain. 39. Nicholas Cavasilis. Nothing here below satisfies. Nothing assuages our desires. We are all thirsty, as if we never reach the object of our aspirations, for the human soul possesses an infinite thirst. And how could the world that passes away suffice? This is what the Lord said to the Samaritan woman. Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. So we live, man that hasn't oriented his desire at the right place on Christ. We live in frustration. We're just all frustrated. We're in a state of perpetual ontological dissatisfaction. Contentment. What Paul says, the secret of life is contentment. How wonderful it is to be content. And I think that we sense that contentment, not like we're not continuing to grow, but we have that sense of contentment when we're oriented in the right way. That's what it means to be content. It doesn't mean that you're not still moving. Number 40, St. Maximus. Since pleasure disappears with the means that produce it, and since suffering always succeeds the experience of pleasure, man threw himself all the more violently towards pleasure because he was trying to avoid suffering. He thought by this tactic that he could separate the one from the other and keep for himself pleasure alone, joined to his love of self and completely unencumbered by pain. But under the influence of passion, he was unaware that it was naturally impossible for pleasure to come without pain. It means the pleasure from carnal things. For the sorrow that engenders pain has been entangled with pleasure. Even of those who feel it seem to forget it as soon as pleasure carries sorrow away under the influence of passion. So, our attempt to find happiness apart from God has been doomed from the start. St. Maximus also says, this undertaking to possess the gifts of God, independent of God, in preference of God, and not according to the will of God, was an impossibility. And we ask, finally, as we close with a final quote, we might ask ourselves how Adam could have traded these infinite delights of the divine beatitude, which is in his very nature, destined him to chase after. How man could trade that for these cheap imitations of pleasure which end in pain, sorrow, and death? And how can we go on doing the same when we even know better? Well, St. John Chrysostom explains this in the last quote here. He says, pleasure is only a fleeting delight, yet, yea, pleasure quickly takes flight, and we cannot tie it down even for a few moments. For such is the destiny of human and sensible things. Hardly do we possess them, and they escape us. They offer nothing solid or assured, nothing fixed or permanent. They flow away more rapidly than rivers of water, and leave empty and indignant those who search after them with such burning zeal. On the contrary, however, spiritual goods present us an altogether different character. They are firm, assured, constant, and eternal. Is it not then a strange folly to exchange the immutable things for transitory delight? immortal bliss for pleasures of the moment, and true and eternal felicity for quick and frivolous sensual joys. He basically goes on to just say it's madness, like there is no explanation. Which doesn't sound very satisfying, except that the good news is when we see the truth of things clearly. When we see the truth of things clearly, then that is the definition of no longer being mad. Well, like when we see it and when we follow it. But we're so often we don't follow it because we don't see it. But if we could see it, if we could know what the truth was, and then we could begin to apply the salve to our souls and make some good choices. Small choices, little choices. Just starting small. Which we're all doing. All of you. You know, I'm trying. I know you're trying. We're all, working out our salvation. And we're trying to replace bad habits with good habits, bad choices with good choices. But I think today, the point of today, or the thing that I was hoping to maybe get across, more than anything, was what somebody shared in the first group, and that was seeing ourselves in a different light. I mean, I know this sounds very negative. Okay, it's going to be really negative. But it's not negative. It's not negative to me. I don't know if it's negative to you. Maybe if you want to have 10 minutes we can chat. But it's not negative to me. It's actually really exciting. It's like good news. Like this is not, we're not trapped in this path. Because this is not who we are. We've just got to trust God. We've just got to be like the Blessed Virgin and say yes. It's really kind of that simple. It's, no, I'm not going to love this. This is not the pleasure I seek. This is the pleasure I seek. And I'm going to devote myself to this and not to this. Because this is me acting in accord to nature who God made. Anyway, I'll stop talking. Anybody want to say anything? Any questions or thoughts?
Speak on our experience of anticipation of physical death and how that gets in the way of us keeping our eyes on that goal of God being our designer. I know personally something that I struggle with is like when I do have my focus on God, the anxiety caused upon my conscience of thinking about like all the things I want to do and enjoy in life being cut short by physical death causes me to scramble away from that desire and try and gobble up things on the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about that. I have that same problem. Like I said, I enjoy doing things. I love this world. I have all kinds of things I love to do. Like you, I know what you're talking about because I relate to you. I like making things and building things and working in the garden, and I have interests, lots of interests, and, as wide as the sea, and I enjoy them, and I find great delight in them, and every day, as my responsibilities as a priest, not just my responsibilities as a priest, which are strangely connected to my own personal life that's no different than anybody else's here. Like I've got a weird combination there because I'm supposed to be devoting myself to Christ just like you are. Just because I'm a priest doesn't mean that I'm doing that. Like I have a job that I have to show up for services and I have to prepare things and do that. But you can do that and not be working on yourself too. But although it does give you some advantage because at least you're spending time reading the Bible. There's a strong connection there. But, I mean, I want to go out and work in my garden. I want to go down and build this thing. Or I want to go do, I have lots of interests. And I have to constantly, I struggle with there. I have to constantly make choices about what I'm not going to do. I was thinking about this today. I was thinking about it yesterday. I really needed to get those lemon cucumbers in the garden yesterday, but I couldn't because I was putting 32 pages of notes together for this retreat. And hopefully I'm getting better at it. I mean, as I get older, hopefully I'm making wise choices. But I can tell you that the rewards of making those choices are worth it. They're worth it. But we're just afraid. I mean, I go out and plant the cucumbers. I could do that. I could pray. I could do this. I could get ready for this retreat. And then I could plant those cucumbers. It's like 7 degrees. It's so beautiful. This is a struggle. I mean, seriously. I gotta go hear confessions for hours and hours, and so winds outside. Outside. And I mean, confessions are boring. It's the same old. When we sin or something, at least make it interesting. I do have a confession to make. The thought has flipped through my mind. If you would stop doing this, I could be outside of my Just please behave. But I'll be totally frank with you. I struggle. Those are just little things. Those are not being drawn away in some high-paying sin, but just small things of having to choose, to sacrifice, to make a sacrifice, something I might rather be doing. And there's nothing wrong with working in my garden, nothing at all. That's not sinful. But I get some immediate pleasure. I feel the sun on my face, the breeze. There is kind of there's nothing wrong with that. And that can be a holy thing and a sacramental thing. But I am often, daily, having to decide to turn away from something that I would like to do that would kind of bring me that level of pleasure. Do something that actually might bring me a little bit of pain. Like physical pain, or tired, or exhausted, or even mental, I guess, deal with something. But really to give myself to this because I know that this is what it means at this moment to focus on Christ. And doing that consistently over long periods of time, the rewards, the spiritual rewards, the stability that comes into your life, which is to me the best thing, is stability. There's peace, there's contentment, there's this joy. There's just no comparison between the two. No. The joys of connecting with people in confession, of somebody bearing their soul and seeing God work through them, it's painful, it's exhausting, it's really hard. And yet, to go through that, to subject yourself to that, and then the gift of you connecting with a human being on that level and seeing God work in their life there's no way to describe it. And yet, we just constantly turn away from that because it's a little hard. And it costs us something. And we want to go over here and, watch a movie. Whatever it is. Go on vacation. And we just miss out on what God has for us. I probably didn't answer the question. I don't know, I was thinking about the Blessed Virgin because we want to do this, or we're afraid, or whatever it is, and he's so patient. He does have a flat nose. God has a flat nose. You know how I know that? Because he's constantly going. I mean, he's thinking, I'm giving you paradise. I have paradise for you. And you're choosing, a dark alley. What's he going to do? Any other? I think it's a good question. I just think it's about living in the reality of what we're talking about. Like you have to believe the truth of what we're saying. If you believe the truth of everything we're saying, that's what you're fighting with, basically. That's what you're fighting against. I mean, I fight it every single day.
I guess I struggle with once I have turned to the good, being able to still enjoy some things that I used to enjoy, and I cannot enjoy them anymore even if I want to. But not necessarily things that are bad, just like watching a movie or something. I cannot enjoy it any longer. Once I've chosen something, I don't know, once I've chosen spiritual good, but it's like I want to be able to enjoy it still.
Yeah.
Something that I guess is not really simple, but it's like I can't enjoy things you used to enjoy as a child when you're just like, this is so much fun. You aren't thinking about this is really time consuming and I could be doing something higher. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean that's yeah. I know what that's like. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like what you just said isn't true.
I guess it's like, should I struggle to be able to still enjoy those things, or should I be like, I'm at a different place now and I can let them go?
I mean, the second one would be preferable, but it's a growth thing, and we're all at different places. And I'm not. Please don't listen. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't enjoy just the normal mundane. We watch movies. I mean, we're movie buffs. We watch movies. Carrie and I do, and we cook and we do things. I'm not talking about everybody just going around like a bunch of boring monks.
That's what I was thinking the first time.
But, by the same token, I don't want to just lie to you either. I mean, there is some truth. It's so unpopular. I mean, I struggle with it too. Like I said, I'm telling you, I mean, I enjoy this life. I like things. I enjoy doing things. And sometimes I feel the same way. I guess you just have to kind of work that out issue by issue. But I've had to give up things. Well, I can give you examples. So I have a garden, right? And I mentioned the garden. I love my garden. So I've only had this garden for a couple of years. And I grew up on it with gardening. I mean, when we planted tomatoes, it was 3,000 tomato plants. I mean, we did serious gardening. I haven't had a garden for 30 years. You know why? Because I chose you over the garden. Because I didn't have a choice. I had my shop at work, because we weren't getting, that was our livelihood, and the demands of that, which are terrible, which I'm not in anymore, and the demands of the church meant that I couldn't do some of the things I wanted to do. I couldn't have it. Much to her chagrin, I couldn't even mow the lawn. I didn't even mow the lawn. I didn't have time. I didn't have time to make a lawn. I wanted to have a garden. Desperate. I chose for 30 years. I didn't have a garden. Because I had to make a choice. So I wanted to wrap it up. God kind of he's rewarded me now. Now my situation's changed. I have a few extra hours I can mess around out there. So it's nice. But if that goes away, that's fine. That's what we just got to be. We do have to be a little bit like monks. I mean, everybody is wherever they are, but there is the ideal. And I think that, like, do you enjoy a sunset more than, Elder Sophrony enjoyed the sunset? I would say probably not. Elder Sophrony probably got pulled into the beauty of a sunset through his awareness, his spiritual knowledge of divine realities in creation, way more than you and I ever had a chance of. I know, there's good questions. But you're kind of putting your finger on what we're talking about here. I mean, these are the struggles I go through, Hey, Vespers. So, okay, like I've been wanting to add Vespers. Well, that's a big decision, but that's hard, honestly, because we have lauds every morning at 6:30 here. And that's great. We've got, we do that and do that for years and years and years. But to add public Vespers at 5, that's tough, because that really breaks the day. The day is really, really short. And you have to be here every day at 5 for Vespers when you're trying to get stuff done. So that's something I've wrestled with. Like, I used to come over and say Vesper. I didn't tell anybody because I couldn't commit to being here every day. So when I decided to put that on the calendar, that was sort of, this had been bothering me for a long time, that I needed to kind of commit to this. That's an example. There's all kinds of stuff like that in our life. But has it been worth it? 1,000,000 times over. Does it mean like every day at 4:30 that I have to get ready over here and I'm in the middle of something? I'm not a little, I have to reorient myself, sometimes, but usually not too much. Like, I made the decision, so, and it's been awesome, actually. Like, changes my whole day. Like, it reminds me what my life's supposed to be about. Pray. That's what we should be doing, is pray. Really? Is that what life's about? I can't tell you how many people say things that are so stupid. They say things like, is that all life's about? Yes! Like, what do you think? What did you think life was about? You're going to die in a few years, and then you're going to face the judgment, okay? You're going to stand before the holy judge, and you're going to give a reckoning for the little, the wisp of life you spent on this earth, and then you're going to go into eternity. What do you think life is all about? Somebody else said to me, one of my family members said, I got a life, Like, oh, I'll never let them live that life. Yeah. Our life has to be oriented to Christ. In this environment, we can preach this message and mean it, and it's real, and it's true, and I'll never stop trying to hold the bar for myself and for you. But that doesn't mean that we're not compassionate and sympathetic and empathetic to all of us, wherever we are in this journey. We're struggling, and we fall down, we try, we're doing the best we can, And as long as we're making an attempt to move forward, God is merciful and kind to us. It's just the point is He has so much for us, available to us. And it's really, are we going to enjoy what we really are hungry for? That's really the point. We probably should stop. And last. Thank you all for coming.
Wow,